The General Assembly, which has some bearing, quite a bit of bearing on education. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So Wade, you're going to be the moderator, and I'm just going to pipe in every now and then.
Sure. So since we have the benefit of having federal member of Congress and then state legislatures here, there's some concepts and some problems here that we're going to discuss that require legislative solutions. And as you all know, we have a federal system of government, so there's different approaches to some of these problems. Some of these are going to be, in some ways, a heavier focus at the federal level, and in some ways there's going to be almost exclusively at the state level. So I'm going to start kind of talking through, and I'll start off with federal, and then we'll break it down into the more granular. And generally speaking, the state's going to have more power to address a lot of these problems. But we'll get the discussion going here, and it may be that if there's just a limited ability for the federal government to act, then Congressman Bishop can speak to that. And but before I go, I'll kind of reiterate again on these are the type of issues that are really difficult to get members of Congress to want to fight on because they're politically difficult to navigate depending on your ability to communicate the idea and defend it and explain it to people. And one of the things I've appreciated about Congressman Bishop, and I literally don't say it, I mean, people have known me for a long time, I'm very hesitant to, because I believe in holding every elected member of Congress and at every level of government accountable. And sometimes that means that these are people I really like, but you got to be sometimes tough on them. One of the things I like about Congressman Bishop and a few other members like Chip Roy, who's my former boss. I mean, I'm just saying that because he's my former boss. I'm being nice to him. But there's a few members that just always seem to be there. They're in the fight, and it's really hard to hold them accountable when they're just not that wrong. Now, that's not to say he's never wrong, but he's just always in the fight. Almost never wrong. Horse mouth. So I've really enjoyed understanding that there's a member and then at the staff level, some people that get it so we can collaborate and partner. And part of the problem is just finding someone to start talking about it. And once you show that you can do it and you can do it successfully and you can dodge all the attacks that will inevitably come your way, other members then feel emboldened to take action and start speaking out with it. And of course, this is one of the things we saw with critical race theory. They filed their bill, and shortly after, a whole bunch of Republicans started jumping on that bandwagon, and his office was one of the first to do it. And then, so thank you very much, sir, by the way. So we'll get into the first issue here, which is, this has been a hot topic in Florida, the parental notification bill, HB 1557. And of course, a lot of this started off with what schools can't hide in terms of mental, emotional, or physical health issues, and schools can't hide education and health records. Those were not as controversial. What the left really keyed in on is the fact that schools can't have instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity in K-3 or in age-inappropriate manner. So immediately what the left said was, oh, you're saying you can't say gay. And so, the pushback to that was, of course, no. What we're saying is that if you are a gay educator or a straight educator, and a student comes up, for instance, and says, are you gay or straight? You can answer that question. But what you can't then do if they say, well, what does that mean? What does gay mean? The response is you need to go ask your parents. And so teachers saw this as because of everything we've learned this morning, as an inability of, to basically advance their agenda. So turning it over to you, and I'll kind of let you talk through this, one, your thoughts on the issue, and then two, is there a federal response on this? There's certainly a state response. We've seen it, but is there a federal response?
Thank you, Wade, and I'm delighted to have a chance to be here to see all you guys. And Sloan, I want to thank you for what you've done here. And you all have been going at this for a few hours. I want to take a minute before I answer your question to say, first of all, thank you for your kind words, Wade. But I want to sort of give an overall picture. It's my pleasure to sit here with the guys who have legislative experience. These guys are experienced legislators. I'm a newcomer. I was privileged to serve briefly with John in the State House, John Torbett, and he's been trying to deal with the unwieldy public education system in the House for a number of years and doing great stuff and carrying on a really difficult task. Ralph Hise, I served with in the Senate. These guys have already done tremendous things. Ralph in the Senate has what is absolutely true. He has the heaviest portfolio of any senator, meaning he is called on by the Senate to to handle more complex tasks than any other member of the body. And so I'm still wet behind the ears, newcomer compared to these guys. I just ended up in that special election that we had in 2019 and ended up going to Washington, where it's a much bigger zoo than it is in Raleigh. And we unfortunately are in the minority, where our main task up there, Wade, is to throw sand in the gears as the lunatics try to steamroll us, and to communicate to the American people what's happening, using, unfortunately, very narrow means of communication, because all of corporate media has been consumed and dominated by the left. So we have that problem. And I think you're right. I don't even know what was your question, Wade? So I have those things on my mind, and I got some other things on my mind too. And you're a politician, never answer questions. I'm going to answer the damn questions.
So there's been, so we have already attempted to stop any federal funds from funding divisive concepts, and what we've seen in Florida is they've taken that a step further to extend that from not just the divisive concepts of CRT, but the divisive concepts of gender theory, et cetera, and to basically stop teachers in K through 3 from providing instruction on sexual or gender orientation.
Yep.
And so the question is there a federal response? What can we do through the Congress to address this? And of course, we know that there's a robust state of response, which will.
And I know, and while that entered my mind to start introducing this in response to your question, is you're absolutely right. One of the things that we confront, or the realities we confront, is to the extent people are paying attention, Congress does get some attention, right? So it's a place from which hopefully you can communicate to people and share with them things that are going on. On the other hand, as conservatives, we know that the Constitution designed Congress to be a legislature of limited power, and we don't want. And one of the greatest dangers threatening the republic is that it expands without limitation, expands constantly, and nobody in the uniparty seems to care, but some of us do care. So some things that you can do. I mean, so here's where we are. I think in the country is that you've got to take the multiple pieces and they got to work together effectively. And I think folks on the right, for a number of years until recently, have often developed sort of a passivity, angry as hell at Washington and other elected officials maybe, but to the point of just turning away from it and not being involved. And I think what we've seen, Sloan, with your activism, some of the folks who are in this room, James Lindsay, who's over there, who we've got some folks who are extraordinarily brilliant thinkers. Chris Rufo is another one who comes to mind, who have caused to bubble up. And what's really new is the availability of activism at the grassroots level that are ready to make things happen. Everything that I have done in relationship to critical race theory has built on that foundation. And frankly, I think the first thing we all need to recognize is that not one of us is terribly important individually. And, you talked about stepping into this area. There was that Frank Luntz was running around Washington saying to Republicans, every Republican should stay 1,000 miles away from this critical race theory thing. And so I said, that's probably the thing to do, is to go get into it. So we did. And thankfully, about Wade Miller's organization and Russ Vogt, who worked with him at the Center for Renewing America, they had been there as Russ had been OMB director to Donald Trump when Donald Trump came out with that brilliant executive order saying we're going to cut out this critical race theory crap out of federal agencies. Well, once the Trump administration was out of office, the proposal that we started working on and in fact introduced as the Stop CRT Act was we could do that. We could say, just as a matter of federal Congress's control over the federal bureaucracy, we're not going to allow critical race theory to be imposed on people, to be used through official sources, and that was the main part of the bill. But we also went one step further, and frankly, have some hesitancy about it. You'll understand why. We said, we're also going to say no federal funds are going to be expended on critical race theory, that kind of crap, around the country. And even when you take that step, you start recognizing, some of the big problems that we face is all the ways in which the federal government reaches its hands down into the work of John and Ralph and all the folks in their states and the localities. So but we've got to take the step we can, and then we have to be responsible enough to say, not all the job is mine to do. And I think the next part is what we're doing today. Thanks to great activists, moms and dads showing up. What has impelled the work we're doing in Washington? We have somebody from the FBI in front of us, or Chris Wray, or the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, and we can tear him a new one. And over the fact that they're using the counterterrorism division of the FBI to target and tag and scrutinize parents who are showing up at school board meetings, we have a robust fight that we can wage there, because moms and dads have shown up in school boards all across North Carolina, all across the country. So I think it's extraordinarily important not to get up on anybody's pedestal about whatever office you're in, because it doesn't matter. You guys are the ones who are important. You guys are the ones who are important, theorizing, James, and helping us understand what we're up against. In fact, the latest thing, James, is actually the productivity of geniuses like James Lindsay is something you guys have to, if you don't follow him, and I bet you all do, but you need to if you don't. New Discourses is his website, and he also has a mean Twitter game that's really almost as good as Wade's. Actually, I don't know who's, but James, we saw each other at a conference down in Florida not too long ago, and we were talking. James said, the next thing you guys should do, you should do like a resolution in Congress that calls out critical race theory for what it is. That it is the acquaintance to Marxism, cultural Marxism, is utterly plain, and that could be reduced to a resolution. You should offer that. So that's a fantastic idea. Could you help me get there? So before the weekend was out, I got a draft of it from James. It's a fantastic document. We've still been, as we drink from the fire hose about things we got to do in Washington, we've been working that through my legislative team, and we're going to introduce that. But that's what I mean. It is a seamlessly connected thing if we're going to be effective. And I think that's what conservative grassroots are coming to understand, have come to understand. And the pioneers among you, Sloan, others here who have stepped out in a big way to make those things happen, we all owe you a debt of gratitude. And I'm grateful, and as long as I'm doing this or whatever else I'm going to do, I want to make common cause with the Ralph Hises of the world, John Torbett, and with the Wade Millers and intellectual strongholds like James Lindsay, but every one of you. This is a social activity we must engage in together. The country's survival, that's what I've become convicted of. We've lost control of virtually every institution in the country. They've been co-opted and corrupted against the interests of ordinary Americans. We do have the resources and the resilience as Americans to change that, but it's going to require an extraordinary effort and commitment, and it's going to have to involve people most of all. It will never happen because of somebody running their mouth in Washington. So with that, I hope that's
So before we transition over to the state response here, one point I'd like to make is that the institutional right in DC basically sees issues like this as, we're in the minority, what's the point? And they forget that one of the biggest powers of a congressional seat is that it's a communications platform. So it is really hard to get booked onto Fox News to talk about an issue if you're a state rep. It's really hard, and you've really got to break through, and there's got to be some sort of news cycle. It's a lot easier if you're a member of Congress, especially if you're a member of Congress who's rabble-rousing and actually in the fight. And so a lot of the GOP that has the ability to go out there isn't, and they're just sitting on their hands. And so they're leaving this on the communication side. They're leaving a lot on the table, and they're basically leaving the states to fend for themselves, while the institutional left was all over the place on these issues. They will go on the attack mode. And so that's one thing to think through when you're thinking about your elected reps, whether it's Congressman Bishop or someone else, is are they using the communications platforms to their maximum benefit to help the states in their fight against the federal overreach. In this case, the answer is yes. Congressman Bishop does that quite a bit, but all too often that's not the case. So turning it over to you, Sloan, for the state response.
Well, I think one of the greatest spokesmen that we have here, and I'm very grateful to our Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson. We have Brian Lebecki here, who's the Chief of Staff, and I'm just theorizing. Sometimes when you say truth, it must scare the hell out of you guys, right? When your leader is speaking the truth, because lately the truth about this stuff, like the transgender movement, that it's evil. It takes a leader like Mark Robinson and others to say that, but the rest of us, even me, because I'll say it. I'll say it. I'm cool. But when I hear Mark, I'm like, so it must be, difficult for all of us to have one man who's speaking this, etc., and then the legislation, which I guess you don't have control over, doesn't catch up. How can you explain that lag between setting these cultural fires, right, and then coming back behind it and legislating? Do you lobby the General Assembly for some of your initiatives?
Yeah, and again, Brian Lebecki from the Lieutenant Governor's office, and just briefly, would have been great if he was here, and we just had a conflict, so you're stuck with me, and I know that's.
We can be meaner to you. We can be mean to you.
That's right. You can be meaner to me. But no, and to answer your question, it is. We do work with the General Assembly a lot. In fact, with these two gentlemen right here, more often than not, and it's part of the challenge with the legislation. And I don't know how much of this you may have already talked about today, but part of the problem with legislating is that you've got some of these things that are kind of embedded, like in our First Amendment jurisprudence, where you're telling teachers what they can teach and what they can't teach, right? Is what we always get as that pushback. And crafting legislation, some of these things that have been going around the country in other states, and we've looked at all of them, some of them are frankly just unconstitutionally vague because they're not specific enough, and they just say, don't teach divisive concepts. Well, first, if I'm a teacher, how do I know what that means? If I'm a parent, how do I know what it means? So these guys that are actually trying to get in the weeds and craft this in such a way that it can be understood and followed, but also enforced, is really the challenge. It can't be too specific. It can't be too vague. And it is a challenge. And I'm glad they're doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, another thing, Senator Hise, you came up with a bill specifically, pardon me, I don't know the number, but it was in 2019, and you had the foresight to understand that social emotional learning would be a thing. And in that bill, it was stipulated that parents would have to have the transparency before the concept was taught. And I believe you also included the risk surveys. The risk surveys, by the way, are a combination of CDC and DPI putting out these biannual surveys that will go to specific schools, etc. Well, this year, we were able to mess up their study and their sample by telling the parents ahead of time what was on those surveys. And we got there by teachers. Teachers are 30% of our coalition. Teachers are in this fight, and I want you to know that. But the point is this, is that you had the vision to do that. What happened to that bill, and who do we need to mess up?
Well, I was always ready to go to war. Woman after my own heart.
Let me first say, in a lot of concepts, Raleigh's about as messed up as it can get. I learned this 12 years ago when I first ran for office, and they couldn't understand what marriage was. That's was coming in. People in North Carolina understood. But just when I thought it wouldn't get any crazier, then they couldn't figure out who went in which bathroom. This was coming in. ACC basketball even left the state over that concept. Now they don't even know what a woman is. This was coming in. So, giving a lot of credence to that environment that's in state government is a little difficult for me. But all this begins at a concept. When I see a scriptural directive that says to raise up a child in the way it should go, that's my directive, not government. grades that's coming in. That is not directed to government. That is directed to me as a parent. I have two 14-year-old sons, both in public schools in Mitchell County. Public schools are the tool I use to help train them up in the way they should go, to educate my children. The responsibility for education never left me and my wife. It is 100% our responsibility. There's this misconception, I think, both on the federal and the state level of having a right to a free and basic education somehow made that government's responsibility. I think the president even said as much recently this week, that they were their children. No, my children. And so everything that's going on in the public schools is me instructing my children because they're the tools. So there is no mask or veil that is allowed in that process. I must see everything you're teaching. We'll be specific. I want to know what they're doing in math this week. I want to know what they're doing in English today. I want to know what they're doing in U.S. history. Let's not even get to the other things, sex ed and those type of things. I mean, that's really the basis of the legislation I put out there. You don't get to take my children for a couple hours and put them behind a mask and hide what you're teaching them or hide what they're dealing with. Now, you may have some disciplinary allowances in your classroom, but disciplining my children is also my responsibility. And I've told all teachers, you have a problem in the classroom, here's my phone number. You do whatever you need to, but I'm going to take care of that problem. That's what's coming in. And so that's quite literally the environment I grew up in a rural public school. But it's so much of that is collapsing, and we just surrendered. And we said, oh, well, government's job is to teach them math. I had a third grade teacher several years ago tell me not to teach my children multiplication tables because it would make them to where they couldn't do the math under Common Core for the arrays of multiplication.
I got to interject. Of course, Ralph graduated from the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics, and he is a mathematician. So for a teacher to tell you about a teacher how to multiply numbers is quite something.
And we can have that argument of like, when they're doing derivatives, we're not going to be adding 7 together 7 times. I'm sorry, you'll never get through that equation in this lifetime if you don't just look at it and say those kind of things. But that same kind of thing back and forth. So my kids recently dealing with the sex ed. Obviously, we had the opt out, so I opted out. So they literally put my kids in a vacant room by themselves for an hour and a half, where they weren't allowed to talk or do anything else. Functionally, the exact equivalent of in-school suspension for the day, because it's my job to teach them about sexual education and make sure that they understand. And that, the faith and others I have are a part of that. But the school somehow thinks that it's their job, and they've got to have the right credentials, and they've got to have the right people to come in and talk about all these type of things. It just missed the basic concept. And so just what we've said in that legislation and others is quite simply, if you're going to teach it, I need to see it. And what I believe is much further than that. It's not just in these specific areas, it's everything. I want to see your lessons plans in English. I want to see your lesson plans in math. It's my job to make sure that you know that. And if you're not doing it, I've got to find something else or do it myself. Until we get that basic understanding and we really break this bondage that says it's the state's job to educate my children, and that my job is just to get them off to the door and pick them up at the end of the day. That's what's coming in. Until we break that mentality, that's why schools have this stronghold. It's because too many families and too many parents believe that we just got to meet the truancy laws. We got to get them there and not miss too many days and pick them up before there's so many days. But the point of that legislation and others, that is a mind change for education in the environment that we're currently in. And so, we're also in this environment with the governor and everything else, what's going to become law. Legislators like that bill that they start day one and they say, in 14 days, this can be signed into state law by the governor. Or if he's not going to sign it, we can override it. In the environment we're in right now, there's not many of those bills out there. The bill that says, Carolina's official color is Carolina blue, might not make it through that process to the House and the Senate and through the governor and then back to the legislature. So, there's a lot of questions about expending energy on things that aren't ultimately going to get there. And then with the court system, they can ignore the law. The courts will use the fact that there's an educational right in the Constitution to make any decision they want supersede state law. Oh yes, you passed a law to do this, but the right to education is in the Constitution, therefore we're throwing out your law and putting it in. And then we have this, I know I'm rambling on, but then we have this system, nobody knows who's in control of education, because we got the State Board of Education, the Superintendent's Office, the courts won't decide, so they just swing the pendulum back to whichever one the Democrats have more influence on. That's who's coming in, so if you elect the state superintendent, now the board's got all the power. If you got a governor in and you got a Democrat superintendent, we'll shift it back the other way. And if they're not, we'll just make them fight with each other to the point that they have no concept or no direction between them. But I think I answered everything.
You raised a lot more questions, though. I'll tell you that.
Good stuff. Okay, so for the purposes of saving a little bit of time, so you brought up a really important point here.